Hi, everyone. I'm Jordan Crow. I am the Senior Director for Policy and Programs with Our Energy Policy Foundation in Washington, D.C. As you can see, we've got a great panel lined up today focused on transmission and delivery to utilities. Um, with that being said, I would like to thank the Earthshot Foundation for underwriting this series. This is our second webinar of our four-part series this year focused on the grid holistically, and this is part of the larger GridIron Terranot series. Folks that are joining us today should be sure to check the Q&A section, drop any questions you may have in there, and we will look at those on the back end and get to as many of those as we can in the last 10 to 15 minutes. With that being said, I would like for Anna to come on the screen here. Anna will be leading the discussion today. She is the principal at WattsNext Advisory, and I will let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. As a GridIron participant, I've certainly appreciated the space that One Energy Policy and the Earthshot Foundation have created to discuss the whole system approach. As you mentioned, we'll be talking about transmission today. It has long been called the great enabler because it's the backbone of our grid. And since for the first time in decades, we've entered a high growth scenario. So interest in transmission is ramped back up. So today we'll talk about all the good things: planning, technology, investment, security, affordability. And we have a great group to cover the range. So let me introduce our panelists and have them come on video as I do so. We have Eric Vandenberg, Senior Director of Transmission Policy at Invenergy; Will Rogers, Principal at Converge Strategies; and Joe Rand, Energy Policy Researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Let's see, we got everyone on. Fantastic. So I'm not going to waste any time. Let's get started. Now, I noticed even during the generation webinar of this series, it did not take long for speakers to start highlighting the risk of transmission availability to get supply up and running. So to start this conversation, from your vantage point, what is the status of our transmission system relative to where it needs to be to meet demand affordably and reliably? Let me start with Joe.
Great. Yeah, this is such a good way to kick it off. I think, Anna, your intro remarks talking about how we're really at kind of an important crossroads and an unprecedented time when we're looking at really substantial load growth forecasts for a variety of reasons. Research that I've led at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has focused a lot on the challenges that generators are faced actually getting connected to the transmission system. And we're seeing those challenges in a number of different ways, from longer timelines and bottlenecks to increasing costs for generators to connect. And I do think that those increasing costs ultimately reflect that the transmission system is becoming more and more constrained as generators that are trying to connect are saddled with higher interconnection upgrade costs to just kind of keep the system safe and reliable. But zooming out from the generation perspective, there have been now a number of studies that have looked at how much new transmission capacity will be needed in coming years in order to kind of maintain system reliability and support economic growth in the United States. And recently, the U.S. Department of Energy put out the National Transmission Planning Study that implied basically a growth rate of roughly 5,000 miles of high voltage transmission built per year. And that's almost an order of magnitude larger than what we're currently building. So in the past decade or so, we've been more on the order of building, I don't know, 500 to maybe, I think last year in 2024 we built almost 900 miles of 345 kilovolt or larger transmission. So I would say there's a lot of kind of empirical data that indicate we're lagging behind where we need to be to meet these objectives of affordable, reliable electricity. And then just the sheer number of miles is very clearly lagging.
And Eric, how do you see this from the developer lens, especially one that develops generation and transmission?
Thanks, Anna. Great question. And I think, like Joe said, this is a great place to start the conversation. So for us, we are the largest privately held developer of generation and transmission in North America. So that's kind of the lens that we bring to the conversation. And, I think our perspective is that regional planning processes have been pretty robust. If you look at MISO's LTRP, Tranche 2.1 was about $22 billion. SPP also putting together some pretty significant portfolios of packages. So those are fairly robust, but where we continue to see a really significant gap is in interregional planning. And that is particularly critical because it's that interregional build out of transmission that's going to really help enable meeting load growth driven by AI. And so why do I kind of put that extra importance on interregional? Like Joe said, in some of the studies that he referenced, we've continued to see that there is really significant value in interregional transmission because it enables that exchange of generation between balancing authorities to where it is needed most at any given time. And just to unpack it a little bit more and really nerd out, it's all about kind of taking advantage of that load and generation diversity that you see across regions. If you just think about where we're developing, SPP and MISO, we're developing a transmission line called the Grain Belt Express between SPP and MISO. That's phase one, and then we're actually going to connect that into PJM for phase two, or excuse me, phase two. If you just think about generation and diversity between SPP and MISO, those loads are not correlated, right? If you look at kind of when those systems are peaking, there's typically differences there, and that's driven by weather, that's driven by differences in the time of day, that's driven by just differences in kind of available generation and load. So interregional transmission has the ability to take advantage of those differences, and where you have excess power in one region, move it to the other region where it might be needed. So that's really critical. The existing Order 1000 coordination requirements for interregional transmission planning have not been effective. I don't think there's anybody that thinks they have been effective. So definitely more needs to be done in that area.
Thank you. Will, how's our system looking to you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Anna. I'll build on a couple of comments that Joe and Eric have made. You know, I look at this from the perspective of having worked in and around the Department of Defense for the last 15 plus years, you know, and I think I'll tell you, one of the crystallizing moments for the U.S. military as it relates to transmission was Winter Storm Uri in 21. I think a lot of people, they come to this conversation thinking, well, why does the U.S. military care about transmission? They've got everything taken care of behind the fence line. And it's true that the Department of Defense has done some pretty important work to do on-site generation and storage with microgrids to be able to support critical missions, but they're by and large still tied to the commercial power grid. And this came to, I think, a real head in 21 when 12 of 15 installations in Texas went down without power for multiple days because ERCOT's system had to shed load as a result of the winter storm that impacted the system. And that was I think in hindsight, looking, hindsight 2020, we know now that that was in part a consequence of the lack of transmission planning, right? And the uniqueness of ERCOT. But I think as we think about trying to get ahead of those kinds of events in the future, we're not where we need to be in order to make sure that regionally aligned organizations like the Department of Defense are not exposed to those kinds of instances in the future. And to Eric's point, we still have a long way to go to make sure that the reliability requirements that are pretty absolute for the U.S. military, where you have no-fail missions or people living out in the community who have to report to the installation for no-fail missions, are taken care of. And so we have our work cut out for us on the reliability side. And then to Joe's point too, there are a number of studies that have talked about how the lack of transmission is impacting, has affected transmission congestion and affordability for customers across the United States. And that's impacting the Department of Defense as well. I mean, there are military installations that are paying more for electricity than they need to be because of the lack of transmission. And that impacts the lethality of the force, because I'll tell you, having worked in the US Army, that budget that installations have for their electricity accounts, it's the same exact budget that they're using to pay for barracks improvements, for airfield improvements. So the more that they're paying for electricity means that they have less money to go into those other core warfighting facilities. And so if we can address the transmission congestion piece that's impacting affordability for customers like the Department of Defense, we'll be able to take more out of the tail and put it into the tooth of the warfighting mission. So.
Thank you. You all naturally went into my next question, which is going to be on planning. And during the GridIron dialogue, this came up a good amount because there's a lot of room to move from reactive to proactive planning. It's the reason FERC Order 1920 put in requirements for long-term planning. But at the end of the day, how each state implements it is going to be very different. And Eric, am I gauging correctly that you still feel there's a pretty big gap in terms of implementing long-term planning?
So I would draw a distinction between long-term planning in the regional context and the interregional context. Order 1920 established long-term planning requirements for the regional context. Several of the regions are already kind of doing things that are consistent with kind of the core goals of 1920. Those 1920 compliance filings are a process that'll go through FERC, and we'll see what FERC ultimately thinks of those. So I mean, that's all to say that there is something in place there in the regional context. In the interregional context, there's nothing right now. Right now, the existing requirements for interregional coordination are essentially what were called coordination requirements. And that's kind of where I take my regional plan, I throw it over the wall to my neighbor, and they throw theirs over the wall to me, and not a lot really happens there. So, some regions have taken it upon themselves to work more closely together, like MISO and SPP, but I still think that remains the exception rather than the rule. So, a lot still to be done in any type of interregional planning.
And theoretically, those should connect, because when you plan for regional, you need to know what's coming in from somewhere else. So that's problematic on a number of fronts. Joe, from the research that you've seen on development timelines across different regions, is it supporting proactive planning? Are you recognizing, we recognize the transmission development impacts generation development, but when you're looking at the numbers, are you seeing a big difference between these regions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, we could bring in a variety of research that would support more proactive planning. I mean, again, like just to go all the way back to the load growth conversation, I think that alone would instill the need for more proactive planning. Like we're looking at a scenario, even if you look at kind of conservative estimates of load growth, we're looking at 2 to 3% per year, which we haven't seen in a long time. And yet we're now in an era where, new generation development can take 5+ years just to get through the interconnection queue and get connected to the grid. If there's grid, transmission capacity and headroom available for those projects to actually connect. So it's not just a question of the timeline. I think it's also a question of like, what's the attrition rate, because many of these projects are facing such high interconnection costs that they ultimately withdraw. So it's a kind of two pieces to that puzzle of both the timeline that is not aligned with the kind of load growth to meet resource adequacy that we need to meet that load growth, as well as just the attrition rate to not get that generation to come online. So I think, again, like, let me just say one more piece, that there's the timeline for generation development, which is already, I would say quite delayed and quite facing major bottlenecks because of those transmission constraints. And yet building new transmission, as we all know, takes even longer than building new generation. So I think, we've seen, I typically see these numbers thrown around like, oh, it takes 10 to 15 years on average to build new high voltage transmission. I honestly think that those are even ambitious. I think SunZia, if I'm not mistaken, took like 17 years from when they first started planning to when a shovel hit the dirt. So, that might be that we're in an era where it's more like 15 to 20 years is typical. And I think, again, Order 1920 has this kind of 20-year planning horizon, but that, we need to be starting today. We should have started yesterday with this planning so that, we're able to meet that load growth and provide that resource adequacy and continue to provide affordable electricity. So certainly I think all the data, Anna, supports proactive planning.
And ideally, when you have better planning, then you're dealing with a better scenario in the interconnection queue. Will, you talked about the role of defense and why this is important, and that is the thing, right? To get grid infrastructure up and running at a greater scale and faster pace is not a civilian mission. It is a mission. It's also a military one, and the military is heavily invested. So from your lens, is there an area where there's opportunity for partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think one, encouraging DoD to be more proactive in the sort of conversations at the RTO ISO level and to inform transmission planning more intentionally, because right now I think the department is really focused on retail level conversations with utilities about its energy needs and not taking the information that it has access to about its load growth or about its load requirements today and forecasted for the next 5-10 years, and getting that information to the people who are making investment in long-range planning decisions to kind of meet the spirit of FERC Order 1920, to be able to more intentionally make sure that defense loads are built into that planning process. Because, yeah, I think they treat one installation as one installation, but one installation across an entire RTO system or DoD installations across the entire RTO system can add up to be a pretty significant load for that system. And so you get into a pretty interesting space where you're talking about, you know, hundreds of megawatts of load that might be unaccounted for in the planning process if you're not planning, if you're not having the right conversations with the right folks. So that's sort of thing one. And then I also think DoD can play a more active role in helping to build out a more reliable and resilient transmission grid. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about with folks in the administration around the ideas of allowing DoD to facilitate rights of way for transmission projects to help speed the deployment of transmission, but also allowing DoD to be an anchor customer the way that the Department of Energy had been in over the last couple of years through sort of modeling the transmission facilitation program so that we can buy down some of the financial risks for these projects. I think those are some of the ways in which the military, recognizing that it has a stake in the outcomes of the transmission system, can play a more intentional role here.
Yeah, and not that different from other technologies where DoD is an anchor.
That's right.
No. On that, you know, as we think about planning for the grid of the future, there's a lot more attention these days on alternative transmission technologies, grid enhancing technologies. And this was also something that was addressed in FERC Order 1920. What do you see as the biggest opportunities in this space? Eric, let's start with you.
Yeah, great question. Definitely a role for new technologies. I think the distinction we like to draw is that, you know, things that are kind of new technologies like grid enhancing technologies, you know, there's definitely a place for those. We see those as being a helpful enhancement to the system, but not a substitute for major infrastructure investments. Again, you know, something like the Grain Belt Express that we're talking about, phase 1 and phase 2 together is capable of transporting 5,000 megawatts. And so that's not something you can necessarily replicate with, you know, things like grid enhancing technologies. So very helpful, supportive of them, but need to still continue to make sure we're supporting large scale infrastructure investments.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And Will, if I remember correctly, there was a defense innovation unit that focused on quickly absorbing technologies that were newly commercial. How often does defense explore grid and transmission tech such as DLR?
Yeah, I think so. The Defense Innovation Unit, sort of like incubating new technologies on energy, is something that DoD has done well over the last 20 years. I think transmission and grid-related technologies is a new space, but I know that DoD is interested in supporting those efforts, whether it's yes, trying to help with reconductoring lines or helping deploy these kinds of technologies and scaling them up. So it's definitely a space that they're interested in. I think when I talk with folks over at DoD, they're trying to figure out how can they play a role in deploying and scaling those kinds of technologies without being disruptive or getting in the way of technology innovators. And I don't think they know the answer to that question. And it goes to Eric's point about making sure that people recognize and are clear-eyed that there's no silver bullet here, but that we have to have a portfolio approach in terms of the kinds of investments we're going to make, and making sure that we're not trying to, you know, do one or the other. We need to do both, and that the Department of Defense can play a role in helping to buy down the costs of reconductoring lines, maybe pulling together lessons learned and help to do hot lining work safely in communities where the defense has a big presence, but also continuing to leverage its buying power to invest in new transmission where new transmission is needed.
Yeah. And so much of the grid enhancing technology is about getting more out of what we have. So on that front, Joe, to what extent can grid infrastructure be repurposed or optimized, and how much space does this create on the system? To Eric's point, right, we know it's never going to equate to a transmission line. We know the needs are great, but what is the opportunity and what do we get out of it?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I love the opportunity to kind of build on what I think Eric's point was, which I totally agree with. I think we're in an era now where, to meet this load growth, we need to exploit all opportunities for capacity expansion. It's not either or, they're not, they don't replace each other, but they kind of offer different things. And in my mind, it's a difference in both pace and scale. So when we think about pace, things like grid enhancing technologies, I think are the fastest to deploy. But on the other hand, they're kind of the probably smallest opportunity in terms of scale, in terms of like how many megawatts they enable. At the other end of the spectrum, we have new greenfield transmission development, and that is the slowest to deploy, as we talked about earlier, but the largest in terms of scale. So again, I think we do need to take advantage of all of these opportunities. In terms of what is the opportunity for GETS, like first of all, I want to say like it's wonderful to see the two FERC orders, 2023 and 1920, both encouraging or requiring the study of GETS, both on the interconnection side and on the transmission planning side. I do think that grid enhancing technologies offer a substantial opportunity, although like Eric said, not as big as new transmission development, but there was a good study from the Rocky Mountain Institute a year or two back that just looked at 5 states within the PJM territory and found the opportunity for grid enhancing technologies to enable, I don't know, close to 7 gigawatts of new generation to come online, alleviating the need for all these major transmission upgrades and just utilizing GETS. So I think there's a substantial opportunity. Again, that's just within PJM. If we look at that across all the regions, we might be able to take advantage of a lot more. And then I should also add, in the middle of that kind of pace and scale spectrum I talked about earlier, and Will talked about this for a second, is reconductoring, and specifically reconductoring with advanced, conductors, not just kind of the same old conductor technology. And again, I'll reference another study that recently came out from UC Berkeley that I think really clearly demonstrated the ability to basically double our available transmission capacity with simply reconductoring in existing rights of way. Now, the last point I want to make, pertaining to pace and scale, well, maybe more pace of development of these technologies, is that permitting is not getting any easier. And I'm sure Eric could talk a lot about that as well. But when we take advantage of things like grid enhancing technologies and reconductoring, you don't always completely get around the permitting issue, but you certainly minimize and mitigate a whole lot of that by taking advantage of the existing infrastructure and existing rights of way. So I think that's a big benefit. And I think we'll maybe come back later in the discussion to talk more about permitting and community engagement and issues like that. But just want to say that's all relevant here in this conversation too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on that, I mean, because upgrades and add-ons cost money, I want to take this conversation to the consumer. Can ratepayers afford grid transformation? Eric, I'll kick it to you first.
I think they can, and we as a society have to figure it out. I think every day here in Washington, AI is at the top of people's minds, and in terms of our economic competitiveness, our national security, meeting that challenge of new load growth driven by AI and reshoring of industry, it's a national security and economic imperative. So from where we sit, that doesn't feel optional. And we as a society need to make sure that we can facilitate those investments in a way that is not burdening regular folks and also maintaining the levels of reliability that we need as a society. So I am an optimist, and I do think we can do that. I think what it requires, though, is something that the electric industry isn't, and the government is not always good at, and that's adapting and moving quickly and doing things a little bit differently. And so I think this is a time where the government does need to take some action and create some new policy to facilitate these things. And I think, at least from our perspective, a couple important things that the government ought to do just to make sure that we're making this transition in a reliable and affordable way. One is, like I mentioned, facilitating interregional planning. That would be very helpful. But the biggest thing that the government can do, in our opinion, is removing barriers to development of transmission infrastructure. I'm There's other barriers that are probably worth removing for generation. I won't speak to those, but from a transmission side, removing barriers and de-risking the development of transmission is critically important to getting these projects built. And so that is permitting reform, like Joe was talking about a minute ago. Happy to talk in a little bit more detail about that later, but then also making some what I'll call kind of boring sounding, but ultimately very important reforms to the way we plan and pay for transmission. And so in particular for merchant developers, there's a lot of unnecessary bureaucratic barriers that stand in the way of building out transmission that people are willing to pay for. And again, these things aren't sexy, but they're very important and they're significant barriers. It's things like not having kind of common interconnection standards for high voltage direct current facilities. It's things like high voltage direct current not being able to provide ancillary services in markets. Things like either not having or having overly conservative standards for when merchant transmission facilities are getting modeled in regional planning. So then consumers are at risk for paying twice for facilities they don't need. It's not having compensation mechanisms to compensate high voltage merchant facilities for the resource adequacy value they provide, and also a number of kind of unnecessary charges and fees that make those facilities less economic to utilize. So those are, again, very boring sounding, but when you add all of them up, are some pretty significant barriers, and those are things that we've highlighted for FERC in the past, and I think removing those and also taking action on permitting would be a really meaningful step towards de-risking and facilitating those types of investments in transmission.
Yeah, that's a really good list. And it is hard in terms of you have regulated services and unregulated services, and the market dynamics between the two have not been simple. Yeah. No, thank you. Will, can I go to you next and add that second component of, is this affordable for the consumer, but also what is government's role in making it affordable?
Yeah, well, I just want to, align myself with everything Eric said. He's obviously the expert in the space, given where he's worked and what he's doing now. So I'm in violent agreement with everything he said. I'll just say from the standpoint of affordability, I think it's important to sort of like define what we mean by affordable, because I think we sort of have tied ourselves in a Gordian knot about what that term means. And I think we put ourselves in a bit of a corner when we try to promise people that their electricity bills are going to get cut while also building out a more reliable and resilient transmission grid. I think those are two almost impossible goals to achieve. I won't say they're absolutely impossible, but I think it makes it very hard if we're making promises that we're not going to be able to deliver on. So I think we need to kind of have a conversation about, and this is at the government level, like within the administration and on Capitol Hill, like what does affordable mean to people? And I think affordable in some cases can be locking in reasonable cost escalation that's below the inflationary cost of electricity, that's not going to squeeze people out and make them choose between buying groceries and paying their electricity bills, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that your electricity bills are going to be lower tomorrow than they were last year. And I think we just have to be straight with people about what that means. Maybe in some cases it will be in certain communities, but I think by and large, you just have to understand what we mean by affordable. And then I also think we get wrapped around this sort of cost allocation around affordability. We don't talk about benefit allocation. And so I think we also have to talk about how transmission and building out a more resilient, reliable transmission grid unlocks certain benefits for communities, particularly ratepayers. And how do we realize those benefits, or how do we not, or how are we foregoing those benefits if we don't make this investment now? And we're buying down, we're avoiding certain risk in the future by making this investment that's hard to sort of like put into financial terms, but we can. And it's hard to do that in a public policy context. But I think we owe it to people to be able to start to do that heavy and hard work so that we can make an informed judgment about whether or not this is an investment worth making.
Yeah, absolutely. I often quote a survey that was done that showed that a third of consumers in the US felt strained by their electricity bills already, and that's in this scenario. That's not something that's going to get easier. And then recently I saw something published about how you can't blame generation for the increase in cost. It's all down to the wires and poles. And so I think at some point we'll get to this later about what is the consumer's understanding of what transmission investment actually means. Joe, I want to go over how much does the lab look at affordability?
Yeah, we do have a number of projects at Berkeley Lab and other national laboratories that are looking at the retail prices of electricity and drivers of kind of changes to retail prices of electricity and affordability and issues related to that generally. So yeah, it's definitely a focus. I think in the context of transmission development. Look, I mean, in some ways, I have very little to add to what Eric and Will have said here. Like, I think there's quite a clear case. Most, if not all, the studies of looking at kind of cost benefit ratios of proactive, well-planned transmission development show very clear, 3 or 4 to 1 benefit to cost ratios. So I think in some ways, I could be glib and say like, well, can ratepayers afford not to upgrade the transmission system? But I understand that it's more complicated than that because big, huge capital investments do imply ultimately some kind of trickle down onto ratepayers' bills. And of course, as Will highlighted, we're in a moment where there's a lot of attention on retail electric rates and individual bills. I want to just reiterate again that Will phrased, I think, this really nicely when he said, can we keep it below the sort of inflation, ordinary inflation rate of electricity? Because I think that's something that we should keep an eye on, that it might not just be, okay, these numbers are going up, I'm seeing my bill go up, but yeah, is it going up faster or slower than kind of general economy-wide inflation? So yeah, I think that there's a little bit of nuance to
I'll just keep going on that thread because as kind of mentioned, the average person does not understand the benefits of transmission, right? And so it's difficult to get support for increasing rates. So when we think about how we get community engagement, how we get buy-in, how do we explain the value and build public trust? Eric, Invenergy has had to do this. So what is the approach?
Great question. So community engagement is essential. So that is something that we prioritize in not just our transmission projects, but our generation projects as well. And so working with local communities, keeping them engaged every step of the way is really, really important. And for us, we feel like we use kind of best practices and really kind of top of the industry in terms of engagement. That said, even if you have the world's best kind of community engagement practices, and again, I think our community engagement practices are extremely strong. When you're building like an 800-mile transmission line, there's going to be people that are upset. And so, I think for infrastructure, the goal is creating a fair process where you're engaging the community, but ultimately there's going to be folks that are not supportive of the projects, and you just have to do your best to deal with those. And we've, I think, been over backwards to try and accommodate a lot of those folks with concerns, and we do our best. But ultimately, there's always going to be individuals and community groups that are not happy, and so you just have to do your best to work around those, and ultimately they may require some sort of litigation.
Yeah, I mean that impacts the timing significantly. Can I just go straight into the permitting question for you, since we're on timelines? Do you see a light in permitting reform, which I feel like has been talked about over and over every year on repeat, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like anyone's coming out and taking a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I think there's definitely the contours of a deal, but I think a lot of the tactical elements kind of remain unclear. I think there is certainly a feeling that transmission could be a really bipartisan point of agreement that is an enabler of a larger package. But exactly what that looks like, I think if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 different answers. And I think the same thing with kind of what folks are looking for in terms of changes to the permitting process. Again, I think if you ask different people, you'll get different answers. I think from Invenergy's standpoint, our position is we are supportive of permitting reform, but to us, the most important piece of that is not necessarily making changes to kind of the core environmental statutes themselves, but what we see is a real need to focus on implementation.
Mhm.
That is having well-qualified staff to implement these, making sure that there is consistency across the board. For us, it is tremendously frustrating when you take an issue to one person in an agency, and then you take that same issue to another person at that same agency, and they give you a different answer. So it's things like that that, again, are maybe not headline grabbing, but at the end of the day, we think those are the primary drivers of a lot of delays that we see. And so those are the things that are the top of the list for us to focus on.
Well, from when we think about, I'll go back to community engagement. I'll bounce between the two because I'm thinking about timelines, I'm thinking about communities, I'm thinking about permitting. Permitting is influenced by a lot of the community components as well. From a military standpoint, what does community engagement look like?
Yeah, so I think it's starting to take shape, which is encouraging, because I think where DoD has not played, where DoD has traditionally played a role as it relates to transmission, or the commercial grid in general, is in the rate intervention process about getting as low of electricity rates as possible. And they've evolved their thinking and understanding that that's not the only place that they can spend their time. They need to be more intentionally engaged in regulatory proceedings and articulating that DoD has an interest in the reliability and resilience of the grid. And so I think sketching out what that means and why it's important for DoD, I think, is sort of thing one, because I go back to where I started, which is that most people, when they think of the Department of Defense, they think, you know, either the fuel the military needs over there, wherever over there might be, somewhere around the world, or the really important work that DoD has done at the grid edge to support its critical missions through on-site generation batteries and microgrids. And the case that always comes to mind is, you think of Marine Corps Base Miramar out in California, you know, can operate independently of the San Diego gas and electric grid for 21 days using natural gas generators, diesel generators, solar storage, and microgrid. Really important example of sort of demand response and being able to be a good partner for the utility to be able to take pressure off the grid. But DoD's sort of a role in supporting the grid shouldn't stop there. It needs to be more intentionally engaged in helping San Diego Gas and Electric or other utilities and transmission owners be able to give them the information that they need to be able to understand what defense loads are going to look like tomorrow and in the next 10 years, so that those load profiles can be built out in how we're developing future transmission. Because right now it's a blank spot within that planning process. And I think making sure that I think the utilities and the transmission operators, they're starting to get it. It's getting the regulators and policymakers at the state level to also understand that this is important, either from an economic development standpoint, because you don't want electricity infrastructure to be the thing that limits the ability of DoD to attract new energy intensive missions to a community, whether it's the F-47 or what I've been talking about as the inevitable offensive defensive AI squadron that might be coming to an installation near you. But also making sure that that if a transmission operator or a utility wants to make an investment that's going to serve a national defense mission, that regulators in the state aren't thinking about it as a single benefit to the DoD, because they need to understand that there's a benefit to a broader rate base in the community. If a transmission line 65 kV or above that benefits the DoD mission also benefits the local community because of DoD's ability to respond in case of a natural disaster, or by the nature of the mission where DoD, 2/3 of their troops and their DoD civilians, they live out in the community. So even though it's supporting the DoD mission, most of the people who are doing that mission, they live out in the community. So I think it's parsing through the who at DoD is benefiting from this and where are they actually at. They're in the community. And so it's the community is benefiting. It's not a single ratepayer benefit here, if that makes sense. And so I think it's we're working through and helping DoD articulate how to engage at the state level through regulatory proceedings and the policymaking process to make sure that folks know that this is not a single ratepayer benefit here. There are opportunities to make sure that DoD is taken care of, as well as the broader community. And that's the part of the community engagement piece that I think still needs some work.
Is there an estimate that you're able to kind of give, whether number, in terms of the size of communities that DoD actually takes up, whether in power or number, or just so folks on the call understand?
Oh, yeah, I mean, across the United States, we're talking 350 communities where you would find a DoD presence of some form. It could be as small as like a National Guard or Reserve facility to a large military installation. And all of these, they're in some form important to what the military does. Guard and Reserve facilities, they seem like they might seem like a small shed that's insignificant, but when the military needs to mobilize to deploy forces overseas, those reserve centers become very important very fast. And they need to be energized for the mission.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Joe, as we talk about community engagement and we talk about permitting and we talk about timelines, what is the estimate of how long everything is taking? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
Yeah, this is a great question. So again, like a lot of our prior research at Berkeley Lab has focused on kind of this interconnection timeline, and we've been able to really quantitatively assess that. But then there's this whole squishy part of permitting that's, you know, overlapping and somewhat separate from interconnection, especially kind of local land use permitting. And it's really very hard to track those numbers down, in large part because we're dealing with a lot of different jurisdictions when we talk about permitting. And I was going to kind of highlight this too, like building on Eric's points, like, you know, I think the challenge of, in many cases, with maybe a single transmission line dealing with federal entities, state level entities, all the way down to county and even individual landowners, you know, all in some sense being, you know, participating stakeholders in this process, and or jurisdictions that actually have authority in the permitting process, it becomes very complicated. We are doing a very massive study at Berkeley Lab to actually collect data focused on generation technologies, but all kinds of power plants, and looking at that permitting process from the first announcement of kind of intent to or application submission of an application all the way to securing permits and ultimately reaching commercial operations. So kind of in line with what we've done with the interconnection queue analysis, but focused again more on that kind of local and state level permitting. Don't have numbers to report on that yet, but just know that that's underway. I will say that, you know, to your question, Anna, we are seeing certainly increasing timelines. We've also our team has done surveys of utility scale power plant developers to ask them what are kind of the drivers of project delays and cancellations, again, on the generation side, but we're hearing them really emphasize that this, you know, kind of community opposition and local permitting and local ordinances, all of these are some of the predominant, in addition to grid connection, which we've been talking about all day, are leading drivers of delays and cancellation of their proposed power plants. So we know that's the case for transmission as well. I also want to emphasize one other point, which is that because we're dealing with all these different kind of jurisdictions and entities when we talk about permitting, I really like that Eric brought up the idea that we need to focus on implementation of permitting, not just on kind of the structure of the rules and regs. And my takeaway from some of the research we've done focused on local elected officials who are tasked with permitting specifically wind energy facilities. We learned that a lot of county governments, and especially rural county governments where a lot of this infrastructure is sited, are just massively constrained and undercapacitated to sort of provide the expertise and resources that are needed to do this type of permitting. So we're asking them to do more in terms of permitting more and more infrastructure with less. They have fewer resources, fewer staff, less money, just through kind of rural austerity measures that have gone through over the years. So I think we need to be aware that, you know, maybe supporting permitting for large-scale energy infrastructure in some ways means supporting rural governments with implementation of permitting rules and providing them with kind of the resources and capacity that they need to do that. And really quick last point, I think, again, just Eric highlighted the importance of a fair process. And again, we've done a lot of research on this, more on the generation side, surveying stakeholders and surveying neighbors of existing power plants. And one thing we learned time and time again very clearly is that, you know, these neighbors and people that are really affected by infrastructure are much more likely to accept the outcome if they believe that the process that, you know, led to that outcome was fair. So even if they didn't get what they wanted at the end of the day, they, you know, maybe they didn't want that power plant in their backyard or in their community, if they felt that it was a fair process to get there, you know, they're much more likely to sort of accept the outcome and understand it as okay. So it's not just about kind of paying people and providing remuneration or paying leaseholders, landowners, paying them lease payments. It's also about making sure that that process is fair and engaging the public in a way that feels meaningful.
Yeah. There's always in power planning that balance of who does the analysis versus reviews the analysis, because that really impacts the amount of resources you need. What last question from me toward the other side of transmission, because not everything is about more transmission. And so I'll ask this of all of you, maybe we start, Joe, Eric, well, how should planners and policymakers weigh investments in transmission expansion versus the non-wire solutions, whether it's distributed storage or demand response, and weigh the trade-offs of that? Joe, I'll kick it. I'll just have you go. Keep going.
Yeah, this is a really tough question. I mean, again, I think there are a lot of, you know, a lot of good analysis and studies out there that kind of look at alternatives and costs and benefits. And I guess I would just emphasize, like, do the diligence, think about the costs and benefits really carefully. And, you know, before I mentioned that I think we're in a time when we need that all of the above approach. So just be, you know, really careful and cognizant, recognize the opportunities where we can take advantage of the lower cost, faster to deploy resources. Maybe these are primarily non-wires alternatives and or grid enhancing technologies type things. But also recognize that that's not sufficient to do it alone. And moreover, that, you know, the types of huge, large greenfield development like Eric and his team are working on, you know, often can provide even greater benefits to society at large. So yeah, I guess, you know, kind of thinking about that all of the above approach and being really careful about examining costs and benefits and recognizing where those opportunities are for each of those kind of opportunities along the pace and scale spectrum.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I kind of wrestle with this, but you know, I think we do the non-wires piece generally pretty well, and I think we don't do the transmission piece well at all. Like that's not fair. I think we are doing it. We just don't. We're not doing it as aggressively as we need to. I think that's borne out by just the facts, right? And it's particularly true of interregional transmission, which Eric has talked about. And I think and it's because it's hard. I mean, as we've talked through it, it's really hard, but it's necessary. And I think we have a tendency sometimes not to sort of move towards friction as a matter of policy. And I think we go towards the easy place, and the easy place has been the non-wires piece. And I think we need to, as a matter of policy, move towards friction and do the hard piece here, because transmission, regional and interregional in particular, is going to be really essential for our economic and national security competitiveness for the rest of the 21st century. You know, I've been doing some work looking back at the 20th century, like the two major wars we fought, World War I and World War II. And it's interesting that interregional transmission was one of the things that helped us to mobilize the defense industrial base during both wars. And then those processes that helped to sort of form interregional transmission and regional transmission collapsed because there wasn't sort of a national security crisis to kind of keep things tethered together. And so we didn't learn those lessons. And I think we should learn those lessons and recognize the importance of that, not because I think we're going to fight a major war in the future, but because of the economic potential that we're missing by not having and not being able to lean into the benefits of being able to pull from the diversity of generation that Eric talked about before, and to being able to lower or not lower, but control for costs and have more affordable electricity now and in the future.
Well, Eric, your name's been called twice.
Okay, no pressure. Yeah, I think probably because I was a federal regulator for a long time, and I live in DC, I think about this kind of at a federal level. In the United States, we don't do central planning at a federal level for energy, for better or worse, right? We just don't do that. And so, from a federal perspective, I don't think Congress or FERC or anyone at the federal level needs to be kind of sitting there kind of weighing, do we do this resource or that resource? I think, like Joe said, it is kind of an all of the above thing. We need to do a lot of different things. And so from a federal standpoint, I think the most important thing we can do is make sure that there are regulations and laws and rules in place that are having market constructs and processes that are sending the right signals about what we need to keep the lights on. And so that's making sure the RTOs are doing their job, making sure those markets are sending the right signals. And then if you get that right, then either the state regulators through their integrated resource planning processes or through the market can send the right signals and folks will make the right investments. So sending the right signals, and then I think the other side of that coin is removing unnecessary barriers. There have been, I think, for a variety of reasons, either due to good intentions or changes in technology and things, there's barriers that can and should be removed. And so we talked about some of those, and I think it's important for the federal government to focus on that too.
Yeah, thank you. All fantastic points. I've also heard my first intense phrase, AI squadron for the day. No, this has been incredibly valuable. I can always ask more questions, but I think it'd be wonderful for the audience to get a shot at you guys as well. So let me hand it back to OEP staff and thank you again.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia from Our Energy Policy. One of our questions now is, how do we ensure that the costs and benefits of grid transformation and the grid infrastructure investments, especially the large-scale transmission investments, are distributed equitably across different communities, especially those historically that may have been underserved?
I can start and then happy to let others chime in. So cost allocation is always difficult, and making sure that there's at least a roughly commensurate relationship between the costs and the benefits of a project is something that has been a point of contention ever since we started building transmission facilities. I'm sure it'll be a point of contention as long as I'm doing this. I think from our perspective, one thing that can help is creating new models, either through the merchant model or maybe certain types of hybrids that allow people to voluntarily buy into transmission facilities. And so they're kind of voluntarily assuming the costs of these. That's really the core of the merchant model and what we do. And so we have transmission development projects. We have folks who are subscribers to that capacity. They're raising their hand. They're taking on the costs of that investment. And so that has two important benefits. One, you've got folks who benefit raising their hand to take on those costs. And then number two, with those types of contracts, it's a fixed price. And so it is not customers taking the price and schedule risk. It's the developer. And that's something as a developer that we're comfortable doing. Whereas most of your typical utility build transmission lines, if there's a change in the cost of the project or a change in the schedule of the project, those are generally passed on to consumers. So no silver bullets, as Joe and others have said, but that's one thing that we're looking at from our perspective.
Thank you. And our next question is, does local energy control through municipalization, electric co-ops, community choice aggregation, etc., play a role in reliability and security?
And I think this is kind of putting on my old hat from my FERC days when I was the deputy director of the reliability office. But, I think local co-ops, municipal utilities, not as sure about community choice aggregators, but I do think those entities at the local level do have a really important role in terms of maintaining the reliability of the system. And that's beyond just kind of the day-to-day operational responsibilities they have. I think they have both a really important role in kind of working with the larger regional grid operator or utility to plan the system in a robust way. Because again, they're going to be paying for it. So their input is really valuable in terms of kind of advocating for robust transmission plans that are going to be able to provide a high level of reliability over all futures. So advocating at that level, and then also at the more local level, I do think there's really great opportunities to do some creative things at the more local level, with things like microgrids and looking at other ways of maintaining local reliability under what we would, as engineers, call off-nominal conditions.
Thank you. And
Julia, can I
yeah, go
jump
ahead.
in real quick? Just one more thought
Definitely.
on that to add to Eric's good points is just I think that those sorts of entities also tend to have a little bit more, I don't know, public facing, public trust than perhaps a larger utility, and certainly than like an ISO or something like that. So I think that those entities also play a role in, things we talked about, like community engagement, explaining value, maintaining and building trust in the public, because they are much just closer to kind of the residential side, the retail side, and the consumer themselves, that they have to have that interface with the public. So there's a role for them there too.
I'll just add to what Joe's saying here too. I think about my experience working with electric co-ops. I mean, they're often in rural communities, right? And they know the needs of their customers. They're credible as service providers where they sit, and I think they're good interlocutors to make sure that the needs of their customers are met. And I think they're on the front lines of some of the more interesting techniques to deploy distributed energy resources and other things like microgrids. And so I think they're certainly playing a more active role as it relates to reliability and security of the sort of last mile distribution for their customers.
Excellent. Thank you all for your answers. And our last question, and this was touched on briefly, but our audience member wondered if there is a place for distributed energy resources or other behind the meter solutions to meet those long delays and bottlenecks faced by transmission expansion.
I'll take a stab at this because I sort of talked about it in my example with Miramar and the work that they've been doing to take pressure off the San Diego gas and electric grid. In that example, I talked about how Miramar can operate independently of the grid for 21 days. And I think those sort of demand response programs, working and leveraging investments that it's made behind the meter, are really important. But I don't think it's a substitute for investing in transmission. I think we have to be able to do both. And I understand the importance of being able to operate independently of the grid for critical missions, whether you're the Department of Defense or if you are a business operation where you have to have 24/7 continuity for operating a data center or for a distribution center like a big box store. So I think those investments are important, and they can serve as real important opportunities to take load off the grid when it's stressed during peak demand during the summer, for example. But it's certainly not a substitute for making the commensurate investments that we need in regional and interregional transmission, both in terms of the planning and the commensurate investments. Just my 2 cents.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to finish us off.
Yeah, thanks, guys. As always, we wrap up promptly at 1 o'clock here. I did want to touch on a few things. Joe, appreciated your thoughts on the interconnection queues. all the way over to load growth. You mentioned some of the DOE studies from that side for folks to look to. Feel free to share those with me, and I'm happy to share those with the audience in our two-pager follow-up. Eric, from the Grain Belt Express to interregional issues, really appreciate your thoughts there. Will, on the defense and resiliency side of things, the need for military facilities. I think in particular, the partnership opportunities that you highlighted, really good information there. So thanks for that. With that being said, Anna, I'd like to also thank you as well for moderating this discussion today. Big thanks to you. We will circulate this recording in our monthly newsletter, so folks be sure to look out for that. And thanks again, everyone. Have a great day, okay?